Tale of the Veiled Woman by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, as translated by Joel Rotenberg. The miner's young wife went to the window of the back room to see if the sun would soon be down to the rim of the mountain. But it was still high. The shadows thrown by the carnations on the sill were quite short, and the roaring stream below gave off a perceptible cool. Although the woman knew it would be a long time before her husband came home from the mine, she stood at the window and looked through the shady tree-tops and past them to a few reddish-yellow spots amid the green. This was the forest path. But abruptly she had to step back and clutch the edge of a table with both hands. The familiar little ravine in front of the window, the small, fast-moving stream roaring at the bottom, and the bent bough of an apple tree reaching all the way down its slope had made her dizzy. She turned anxious eyes to her 3-year-old daughter playing on the floor. The smiling child looked at her, and her mother felt that warm blood had again begun to flow to her heart. The young woman's face took on a bright, transfigured expression. She knew that she was carrying a second child beneath her heart, and that she had only just sensed the presence of this new life and had not yet felt its stirrings. She interpreted these anxious movements of her blood as a surety of its imperceptible growth. She took the child, whom she was already thinking of as the older one, by the hand and went out of the room. But when she had closed the door behind her and was standing on the dim stairs under the eaves, a new feeling of even more intense apprehensiveness came over her. It was as if she had closed the lid on a casket as she shut the door, as if all the happiness in her life had gone forever along with the bright room behind her. Her feet seemed to be filled with lead. Once she had come down out of the house, she had to sit on the stone rim of the well, temples pounding. The child immediately ran down to the house wall and began to dig a mouse hole with a bent old tin spoon. She asked something. Her mother gave no reply. She had turned her head, and her gaze was caught in the dark depths of the well shaft. She saw the shady chasm and saw something alive, something infinitely dear to her, descend. She could not move, could not cry out, and with paralyzed legs and glassy eyes had to let what happened happen. A rapidly spreading inner clarity told her suddenly that it was not a present but a future suffering whose shadow was falling over her like a leaden veil. Her left hand pressed against her womb. She seemed to feel that a dreadful, nameless fate was in store for the being germinating inside her. The knot of fear gradually left her, seemed to loosen and merge with its surroundings. Light and dark, mountain and stream and wind seemed to be a single danger, lying in wait, not for her, but for the being to what she would give birth. In her uneasy darkness, her new mother's feeling shone through more and more strongly. The spasm gradually subsided. The child stood before her in a reddish haze and plucked at her clothes. The sun had long since set. All was in cool twilight, and the child cried loudly, pulling at her hand, what she still held pressed to her womb. She had been sitting that way for 4 hours. She stood up and shook the apprehension out of her somnolent limbs. A flame-colored double carnation bent out of the darkening bedroom towards her like something alive. The young woman told herself, "I can't be sad while he is inside me. It's bad for him," and raised her arms and reached for the carnation, breathed in its vivid brilliance and its fragrance, and sang in a low voice, something that she remembered from an old songbook. "Oh, little pinks, so fine to see, your finery's just masquerade. When the time runs out on Judgment Day, and earthly souls are all set free, where, oh tell me, will you be?" She sang just to be singing, and paid no attention to the meaning of the words, but thought instead of going to her husband, kissing him, and withholding her secret worries from him, hiding them entirely. Meanwhile, she saw a man emerge from the shrubbery on the other side of the stream and clamber down the slope like someone looking for a way across. He was dressed like a mountain miner, yet oddly, and all in the same dark material. Strands of plain brown hair fell from beneath his cap to the left and right, framing his pale young face. He held on to a branch of his left hand and looked across at the young woman. His lips, she could see, were thin, like two knife blades pressed together. He seemed to be bringing a message, and not a pleasant one. He swung to the right on the branch. The woman came forward around the corner of the house, but when she went to the fence and leaned over, the stranger was gone. And up and down the stream there was not a twig to be seen floating or being jerked this way and that by the swirling water. She was afraid to be alone in the twilight, with the thunderous, roaring voices of the water. She took the child, went into the kitchen, lit a lamp, set it on the stove, and then a second, and set it in the small barred window. She began peeling potatoes, and the child was delighted by the shadow thrown on the wall like a coil of ribbon. Meanwhile, her husband was walking down the road leading from the mine entrance to the village. He walked now on the right side, now on the left side of the road like someone deeply lost in thought. On the old stone bridge over the dark rushing water, he stopped and looked expectantly from the rock face up to the powerful lowering clouds which were still illuminated overhead, and down with still more agitated anticipation into the wet, roaring chasm, as though a secret door into the heart of things was going to swing open for him on silent hinges. And at that very moment, for he knew now was the time. There had already been sign after sign whose meaning was that the time was coming. For a long time he had not understood these signs. They seemed unimportant, though marvelous. Although they were portents, he took them for memories. He took them mostly for scattered, arbitrary, and sweet memories from an indefinite earlier time in his life. On one occasion he felt an indescribable sense of well-being when he leaned with his left hand against the wall of the mountain. Another time his eyes closed when the damp cool of the dark pits enclosed him, and, burrowing deep into himself, for a moment he felt he was in the sweet and perfect innocence of childhood. Sometimes it was so strong that for a time he thought dreamily that each of his hammer blows in the rock, and then each of his steps in the open air, was taking place in a realm of memory. And as he was working one day in such a state of mind, there was an unfamiliar young miner with brown hair and long strands standing behind him in the light of a miner's lamp, who watched him for a long time, and then, without the coal miner's greeting, Glukauf, began to speak with his thin lips, asking him many questions. "Who are you?" he asked the stranger. "Never mind about that," replied the stranger quickly. "I am here, and wish to help you find good fortune." "But first I want to know who you are and where you come from," he repeated. The stranger grimaced impatiently and came close to the man sitting among the rocks and bent over him. "I'll tell you who I am," he said, "so that we'll be properly acquainted. Today, as you worked in silence, did powerful memories again come to you?" "Yes," said the other, half involuntarily. "And did you wonder a little, where am I striking this hammer blow? Here, or 1,000 miles from here, eh?" The other assented with his eyes. "And when you are at home, and go from one room to the next, and close one door behind you, and open another, don't you feel that you are not walking about in the rooms of your house, but are opening and closing doors somewhere very, very different, 1,000 worlds away?" The miner felt so transparent that it was as if something were being taken apart within him. "And are you just going on that way," continued the stranger, "saying nothing, not trying to understand, not wanting to know where it's all heading?" "Yes. Am I supposed to do something?" asked the other. And at the very thought, a feeling of infinite emptiness and despair came over him. The stranger laughed soundlessly. "Nothing is supposed to come out of you. You have to go in. A person like you has to be pushed into his own happiness. You really think it's all memories? Have you ever had such a feeling of happiness before? Haven't you guessed that they are nothing but signs, ethereal prefigurations, mere premonitions of the nameless happiness that's waiting for you? How many times must the veiled woman send for you before you're ready to go to her?" When he heard this mysterious name, the miner felt a lamp had gone on above him. The force of its illumination, driving through the oppressiveness of the dark rock to the left and right and overhead, and even through his entire body and everything beneath him, so that he was standing illumined in the center of a vault flooded with light and above a glittering abyss. And from within him, an inexpressible, completely new, and yet entirely definite sensation of himself took hold, which contained all the earlier inklings of blissful feeling, but only like little bubbles, now dissolving in the crystalline, flooding, shining clarity of the whole. He saw the stranger as a smaller and more indistinct figure in front of him, as if he were standing far down and on the other side of gulfs as deep as a mountain was high. He felt compelled to call out to the stranger, "I'm going to find my mistress." He was surprised to hear those words coming out of his mouth, floating off soundlessly into a space so monstrous that his head swam. At that moment he heard heavily shuffling steps approaching him, and heard himself addressed by name. "Hyacinth!" And again, "Hyacinth!" "See that?" said another voice. "I think he's sleeping," answered the other, "or he's talking to a Carpathian." The light of a miner's lamp swiveled, and in the dark tunnel, two miners who had been working in the next gallery stood before Hyacinth. The stranger was gone. "Has your lamp gone out?" one asked. Hyacinth made no answer. Silently he gathered his things, walked past the others to the hoisting shaft, and left the mine. His feet followed the road home out of habit. He walked now on the right side, now on the left side of the road, and hardly knew where he was going. He felt only the deep need driving him toward the veiled woman, whose distant, hidden presence was so overwhelming him that he felt her existence more strongly than his own. On the other side of the arched bridge, he stumbled and struck his ankle hard on a stone. As he felt the pain, the thought came, "The one who hits his leg on a rock as he walks along, that is not me. I go over rocks." And as he at that moment threw his head back and saw a sparrowhawk circling in the already chilly last light, its fierce cries pressing downward, it came over him in an instant that he did not know if he was the creature down below, moving forward on the darkening hillside, or the other one, gliding overhead with wings outstretched. But he knew not now that all of this was only a portent of what awaited him. When he was standing before his house and saw the light coming from the small barred kitchen window, he gazed at all of it strangely. He felt he had not seen any of it for years, and even now was not seeing it truly, but only as if he were going by in an anxious dream. He went to the bright window to look in. He noticed that the bars threw sharp black shadows obliquely onto the whitewashed wall, but that his own head did not. He raised his hand between the light and the wall, and his hand too threw no shadow. He went into the house, hung his cap on a nail, and opened the kitchen door. His wife started up in fright from the low wooden stool when he entered, and the peeling knife clattered to the floor. "It's you! It's you!" she brought out with effort, and there was a smile on her frightened face, and she clung to him, while the child cried fearfully, her head pressed against her mother's knee. "I've been sitting and listening," the woman said, "hearing every mouse, every beetle outside, and I didn't hear you. Didn't hear you in the garden, opening the door, coming into the hall and walking in. We were both so terrified. It was as if empty air had suddenly taken on a human shape, the way you were suddenly there." She went into the other room. The evening meal was quickly served, and the child was soon calmed with her milk. Each time the woman came to the table and into the light of the tallow lamp with a dish or clean spoon, her innocent young face seemed to Hyacinth to have changed. He had placed the lamp so that no real light fell on his face. The child was sitting in full light, and as the woman now bent forward to wipe the child's mouth, he thought he saw a toothless old woman with withered cheeks and hollowed temples, slowly stroking the shining, soft blonde head of the child, as though craving living warmth. He stood up and said, "I am very tired, and I want to lie down now." He took the lamp and made sure to slip quickly through the door. The woman lit a piece of kindling, gave it to the child to hold, and quickly cleared the table. When Hyacinth had closed the door behind him, the lamp flared in his hand, and where it threw its unsteady pale yellow light, it seemed to the man as he walked that his entire house had changed. The walls old and with weird cracks like the walls of an old churchyard. Even the floorboards, now strange and sad, the handles on the doors neglected, as if no hand had touched them for many years. He undressed and laid his clothes on a chair next to the bed. He had set the light on a ledge on the wall, and from there it shone on his clothes, and they looked sad, like the bundle of clothes that is sometimes placed on a morgue table next to the sheeted body of an unknown person. Meanwhile, the woman and the child were scratching at the door. Their light had gone out, and they were unable to find the handle for a long while. When they entered, Hyacinth had to remember who this woman and child were, and how it was that they were sleeping in the same room with him. The woman who put her child to bed and covered her, who went about silently in stocking feet and loosened her hair, seemed to him like a corpse that had climbed out of the grave in its white linen to play a strange, wordless game. When she turned her face towards him to see if he was sleeping, breathing out of her young mouth through half-parted lips, he saw the bony, lipless skull under the skin, and with an inner moan that did not give voice to a profound terror, put out the light. Now the dear familiar form was standing in the dark. The dark hair flowed over the white gown from shoulders to breast. Not breathing, she looked at him, and nodded in motherly satisfaction when she thought she saw him fall asleep. This nod came to him. Even as he sank into the bottomless depths of a dissolving sleep, his awareness hung on to it for an instant as to a sweet-smelling bough. He felt himself smile, felt the other bed move slightly, and was asleep. He awoke and knew that a voice had called his name. He sat up in bed and knew immediately that now the beginning had come. He got up, and the bed did not creak. He walked on the floorboards, got into his clothes, and there was no sound. He heard the woman's calm breathing, the more rapid breathing of the child, and outside the nighttime roar of the stream. There was the call again. He swung out through the window and ran among the dew-covered weeds down to the road. The road was empty under the moon. climbing up to the wood and running down to the great dark valley. He did not stand there long. A sound came from above, half rustling, half rumbling, not like the roar of the torrent or like boulders tumbling. It came closer, and then burst out from between the giant dark pines with a ringing of hooves, wild snorting and heavy rolling, rumbled up to him, and it was a carriage, larger than that of the Prince Bishop of Brixen. And when it reached Hyacinth, the driver, a large man with grim, gleaming red face, pulled up the 4 heavy, panting workhorses, and the carriage door in Hyacinth's side sprang open, and he climbed in and fell back into the cushions, and the 4 horses pulled the rumbling carriage onward.